He walked out of the closet with a loaded handgun and a look on his face that his wife had never seen before. At first, she assumed it was for protection. What transpired next, however, transformed their house into a terrifying scenario. Let's look at Neil Jacobson's twisted mental breakdown, the savage killings of his own family, and the astonishing trial argument that attempted to justify everything. Neil Jacobson appeared to have everything: a successful profession in mortgage banking, a lovely house in New Jersey, and a girlfriend at his side who shared his goals. When he met Frankie, things went quickly. Marriage, an adventurous lifestyle, and financial success. It all seemed like a dream come true. But perfection is an illusion. And underneath the polished picture, fractures were growing that no one would have seen. From the outside, Neil and Frankie seemed like the ultimate power couple. Both had lucrative positions in finance and lived an active lifestyle, riding along gorgeous trails, diving into the deep blue, and taking lavish weekend trips. But there was something they couldn't afford, and it haunted them for years: infertility. What began as optimism rapidly devolved into a draining cycle of therapies, setbacks, and emotional despair. Each unsuccessful effort increased the tension between them, and when people break down under strain, they either come together or split apart. After years of searing despair, the impossible occurred. In 2003, they had twin sons, Joshua and Eric. Their friends and relatives believed that this was the watershed moment, when all of their anguish would be replaced by pleasure. However, pleasure does not erase years of unspoken anger. Neil was no longer simply a spouse, but a parent. That included expectations, sacrifices, and obligations that he may not have been prepared for. Frankie, his former adventure companion, was now concerned with parenthood. The dynamic evolved, but not in a manner that enhanced their relationship. Neil excelled in the high-stakes world of banking, but success has its drawbacks. The long hours, the stress, and the need to constantly be on top sapped him. At home, the warmth between him and Frankie had cooled. Arguments became regular. People began to notice that the previously confident guy was preoccupied, distant, and anxious. Tension-filled whispers circulated. Some believed he was drowning under the weight of it all: parenthood, employment, and a failing marriage. Others felt that Frankie was not as supportive as she seemed. But one thing was certain: the beautiful life they'd created was dangling by a thread. Success, love, and a family. It was everything Neil had ever desired. So, why did everything go so horribly wrong? Everyone who knew them would be astounded by their answer. The subsequent events were unexpected, and once the truth came out, there was no turning back. It began with a choice that seemed to be love on the surface, but was really something very else. Neil Jacobson wasn't simply a family guy looking to be closer to his parents. He was a guy pursuing control, disregarding red signs, and leading his whole family into a storm he didn't see coming. In 2000, his parents, Harold and Goldie, relocated to Florida. But by 2005, when Harold was afflicted with cancer, Neil had disintegrated. The thought of being apart from his father grew agonizing. That's when things began to alter. Neil persuaded himself, and everyone else, that relocating the family south was the correct decision. But this was not about starting again. It was about desperation, and it was about money. Neil had previously invested heavily in Florida real estate prior to his major relocation. He didn't just buy one or two houses. He invested in multiple pre-construction condominiums, certain that their value would explode. Frankie was not sold. She recognized the hazards. But Neil did not want to hear it. He was all in, investing their future on something that had yet to be developed. Frankie adored New Jersey. She had friends, a career, and a home there. However, when the figures started adding up, she succumbed. The financial strain was building, and Neil made it plain that there was no space for hesitance. So they packed up, left everything familiar behind, and headed to Florida to pursue a dream Neil had already staked too much on. However, the fresh start they were promised did not endure. Harold died only 2 months after their arrival. The loss destroyed Neil, but it also left Frankie keeping everything together: a heartbroken husband, 2 young sons, and a home built on questionable investments. It was all collapsing faster than she could grasp it. Most people believed Neil's life began to unravel once his father passed away. But what's the truth? He began to break apart in childhood. Neil's mother said that he was never entirely all right. Even as a toddler, he was preoccupied with becoming the perfect child, not just excellent, but faultless. If anything didn't go as planned, it ate away at him. That mentality did not go away. It developed. As an adult, it developed into compulsive behaviors and unrealistic expectations for himself, Frankie, and their children. Everything had to fit his mental ideal. If not, he wouldn't be able to manage it. Neil invested his life assets in Florida real estate, certain he had discovered a windfall. But when the Great Recession arrived, that treasure became a sinkhole. The market plummeted. Condos stood vacant. And how much was everything he'd purchased worth? It dropped dramatically. He not only lost money, but also lost control. The firm he had established from the bottom up was failing. The deals he previously boasted about were losing money. Meanwhile, what about the subprime mortgage rates he expected? They surged, and every investment seemed like a huge mistake. Neil suffered as the numbers declined. He was not sleeping. He was not thinking clearly. Everything focused on mending the disaster. But the more he tried, the worse it became. Frankie, who had reservations about the relocation from the beginning, was suddenly locked in a financial nightmare she had not anticipated. Neil refused to accept he was wrong. He pushed harder, took riskier actions, and disregarded reality. Behind closed doors, his conduct grew unpredictable. He wasn't simply worried. He was losing control. Neil clung to the concept of being perfect. He couldn't accept defeat. He couldn't confess his vulnerability. And the obsession? It cost him everything. Instead than repairing things, he buried them. Instead of opening up, he closed down. Frankie attempted to keep it together, but Neil didn't listen. He didn't want aid. He wanted power. And as control slipped through his fingers, he did what any guy would do: dig deeper. Because this wasn't just a financial setback. It was a complete collapse of a man, his wife, and the mask he had worn for decades. Remember, if you're a true crime aficionado, as I believe you are, press the subscribe button for more cases and updates on cases like this. Neil had taken satisfaction in the fact that he was always prepared. Whatever the challenge, he'd find a solution. But this time, he ran out of options and time. The financial collapse was occurring quicker than he could concoct another tale. And the truth? He was drowning. Neil had been living his life on borrowed time. For mortgages, and hardly a trickle of cash had him scurrying. It was more than simply worry. It was a ticking clock. The bills never ceased. Neither did the calls. Debt collectors, late notices, and warnings become more louder over time. They first tapped into funds, seeing it as a temporary setback. But it wasn't. It was a black hole. The funds depleted faster than anybody thought. Frankie attempted to remain cool, but she could see the writing on the wall. What about their safety net? Gone. What's their backup plan? There was not one. Neil took rash decisions out of desperation and terror. He pursued dubious agreements, asked for loans, and sought to sell assets that were already worth less than they owed. Nothing worked. Every move made matters worse. Instead of stopping losses, Neil doubled on, pushing Frankie and his friends further into the quagmire. With little money and no future in sight, Frankie made the call that Neil declined. She stopped paying the mortgages on their Florida residences, not because she wanted to, but because she had nothing more to offer. It was the breaking point. Neil admitted that the fantasy he sold her was unreal, because when the money was gone, something inside Neil broke. What he did next transformed the tale from tragedy to something far worse. Initially, it seemed to be stress. Then it changed into something darker. Neil was more than simply overwhelmed. He was paranoid, unstable, and sliding into a world that only he could see. The guy who had operated a company was now shutting himself in, mumbling about monitoring and hidden dangers. Deborah, Neil's sister, saw right away that Neil wasn't the same anymore. His conduct was unpredictable, and his thoughts were scattered. He seldom talked or moved, and when he did, it was solely to express terror. Frankie also witnessed it. She resorted to her own sister for assistance since living with him had gotten stressful. Every day came new fears, obsessions, and breakdowns. He stopped going outdoors, refused to visit pals. He seldom talked to his children. Even his hygiene had fallen away. This was not depression. It was a complete breakdown. He stated that his phone was tapped, that his home was being monitored. The agents were outside in unmarked vehicles. The walls he created about himself were not for protection. Rather, they were a prison. Neil feared he was being investigated by the FBI. Federal operatives were keeping a close eye on him, ready to strike. He murmured about being in big trouble, but couldn't explain why. He informed his mother the FBI was on its way, his voice trembling and his eyes bulging. But when she questioned what he had done, he couldn't answer. He did not know. Perhaps he did, but couldn't accept it. Whatever Neil was hanging on to, his business, his ego, his sanity, had gone. What happened next would rock more than just his family. It reveals the depths of a person's delusions. Everyone saw the indications. Friends sensed the remoteness. But no one anticipated how far gone he was. Neil had entered a realm beyond rationality, where terror dictated every action. And as his loved ones scrambled to assist him, Neil was silently arranging something they never expected. In his distorted imagination, danger lurked everywhere. He thought that others were after him, that his children were at danger, that Frankie was concealing something. He stopped trusting anybody, even those closest to him. The same guy who previously believed that family meant everything was now certain that they would all be better off without him. Frankie was fatigued. Neil is exhausted from the financial strain, the solitude, and now his paranoia. But she had no idea how far it had gone. She had no idea he was sure that the FBI would arrest him, or that he thought they would take the children away. She had no idea that in his distorted thinking, he believed there was only one way to end everything. He had denied assistance for months. I wouldn't visit a doctor. I wouldn't visit a therapist. Refused to accept that anything was wrong. It was too late for his mother and sister to comprehend how serious the breach had become. Paranoia had crystallized into belief. The worry had escalated into obsession. The guy they once knew was gone. Because Neil did not wait for the FBI. He did not wait for the repo guy or the bank's next call. He took things into his own hands. And what he did would stun the whole neighborhood, leaving an indelible taint on his family. It was simply another calm day in the Jacobson house. Nothing strange. No screaming. There are no indications of turmoil. Despite the quiet, Neil had made a choice. One that would kill lives and cause irreversible harm. Frankie was sleeping. The children were nestled in. That's when Neil took action. He did not strike out in wrath. He was relaxed, calculated, as if he really thought he was rescuing them. In his opinion, it was not murder. It was for protection. What source? He never actually spoke. However, the consequence was irrevocable. Frankie was gone. The home remained quiet, but Neil wasn't done. Covered with insides, he reloaded his rifle once again and turned toward the corridor. He wasn't thinking like a parent. He acted as if he had nothing to lose and would not allow anybody else live. Neil entered Eric's room. The youngster was sleeping soundly, face down, utterly ignorant of the impending catastrophe. Neil aimed, then shot. 2 gunshots smashed through Eric's thin frame. However, Eric managed to live. He still breathed, still fighting. Instead of pausing, Neil picked up a cushion, holding it over Eric's face, and pulled the trigger twice more. That was it. Eric's life is gone. There is no prospect of waking up. No time to yell. No compassion. Just quiet. Joshua lay curled up in bed. Safe. Innocent. Dreaming. He did not hear the previous gunfire. Didn't realize his brother had already left. Neil did not hesitate. He put the pillow over Joshua's face and repeated the process. 2 consecutive shots. Both guys vanished as quickly as they appeared. Josh and Eric. He has twin boys. His miracle children. The ones he had battled so hard to bring into this world. He yanked them out without warning, without compassion. Whatever remained of Neil's sanity evaporated in those seconds. He did not have a breakdown, as shown by his actions towards Frankie following. It resulted in devastation. She discovered her boys. And then she saw Neil. He did not run, did not deny it, simply stood there, empty and distant, like he has already departed this planet. However, he was still alive, and it meant he'd have to account for what he did, whether he knew it or not. When Frankie understood what Neil had done, instinct kicked in. She did not hesitate. She rushed at him, screaming, clawing, and fighting for her life, and maybe for one final opportunity to safeguard what little she had left. However, she was not up against the guy she married. She was up against something black. The battle was terrible. They plummeted to the ground, her hands grasping for the weapon and his fists clenching in wrath. He did not hold back. One strike destroyed her front tooth. Another ripped open her finger. Despite his injuries, Frankie refused to give up. She refused to die without a struggle. He was stronger. Even worse, he remained calm, cold, like nothing mattered. While Frankie cried, pleaded, and fought for life, Neil moved like a machine, focused, unshaken. He seemed to have accepted his chosen ending. With blood on the floor and desperation in the air, Neil overwhelmed her. And as if nothing had occurred, he quietly reloaded the gun. No emotion, without hesitation. Frankie, bruised but alive, could only watch. 2 POWs, straight into her face. And with that, he silenced her forever. No goodbyes, no compassion, just the last, callous deed in a horror fiction he wrote. His following actions would stun even the most experienced investigators. The home remained quiet. The odor of rifle powder lingered in the air. When officers entered the house, they discovered Neil on the floor, barely conscious. There's blood on his clothing, and the murder weapon is still in his grasp. He was not running. He was not hiding. He was simply there. His voice sounded feeble, cracked, as if he already knew there was no way to reverse what he'd done. "I killed my family," he murmured. No emotion. There's no explanation. A chilly confession sent shivers down the spines of every officer in the room. Was this a sudden break, or something deeper? Detectives wanted answers. And quickly. The scenarios seemed to be filled with fury, yet the planning suggested differently. Neil had reloaded, moved from room to room. He methodically killed his wife and children. That does not constitute panic. That is premeditation. Some others pointed fingers at his mental condition. Others blamed medications. However, none of this justified his cold, premeditated actions. He did not hesitate. He did not spare anybody. He didn't even attempt to assist afterwards. He merely sat there, like if everything was part of a perverse plan. Was Neil Jacobson a damaged guy who eventually lost it? Or was he someone much worse? A man who prioritized power above compassion, even if it meant spilling his own blood? The courtroom's next revelation would compel everyone to choose sides. Neil's trial did not revolve on whether or not he did it. He has already confessed. The question was why. When it came time to explain the unfathomable, his defense team had only one response: blame the drugs. They portrayed Neil as a guy on the verge, plagued by melancholy, anxiety, and paranoia. They argued that his mind did not spontaneously shatter. They said it was pushed by medicine, by chemicals, by side effects. In summary, they said Neil was not a murderer, but rather a victim. The defense relies heavily on the theory of madness. They came in specialists. Testimony followed testimony regarding how certain antidepressants might cause delusions, and how, in rare circumstances, the distinction between reality and terror is blurred. However, hazy lines do not explain the 4 reloads. They don't explain the stillness or precision. They informed the court that Neil honestly felt the government was monitoring him, that his phone was compromised, his family was in danger, and with his finances deteriorating and his grasp on reality fading, the drugs just made matters worse. This was the narrative they told. But here's the issue. Frankie and the kids were not hallucinations. Neil never phoned for assistance. He did not pause when the first shot was fired. He continued until there was no one left to stop him. Many individuals battle with their mental health. Plenty of people take Zoloft, Xanax. They do not do what Neil did. They do not plan, reload, execute. This was not a blackout. It was a decision. No drug can make up for it. After weeks of testimony, expert views, and innumerable efforts to deflect responsibility, it all boiled down to one thing: accountability. The jurors did not believe the sob tale. They did not observe a victim. They saw a guy who planned, acted, and never attempted to stop himself. The courtroom became hushed as the judgment was read. Guilty of killing Frankie. I am guilty of Joshua's murder. Accused of killing Eric. No compassion, no sympathy, no misunderstanding. The jury saw the reality as it was. Neil Jacobson had made his choice, and now he would have to pay for it. His sister, mother, and friends couldn't defend him longer. What he did was beyond reason and forgiveness. Frankie's family sat in tears as they heard the words they had been waiting for. Finally, justice prevailed. However, no amount of sentence could bring their loved ones back. No parole, no second chances, just a cell and a lifetime to deal with what he did. But here's the truth. Neil's punishment began when he chose power above compassion. He transformed his dread into violence. That's when he quit being a spouse, a father, a man, and with that, the mask came off. A guy who was formerly seen as successful, faithful, and even admirable has been exposed for something his family never expected: a calculated destroyer, a cold-blooded executioner. Because no justification, diagnosis, or argument can undo what Neil Jacobson did. If articles like these leave you dumbfounded, furious, or wanting to know more, click the subscribe button and enable alerts. Every week, we delve into the darkest depths of real crime, and you won't want to miss out on what's next. With that stated, thank you for watching, and until next time.